The sun dipped low over the quiet streets of Willow Creek, a suburban neighborhood in upstate New York where maple trees lined the sidewalks and picket fences framed tidy lawns. For Thomas Bennett, a 52-year-old widower, this was homey, a two-story colonial house left to him by his late parents. The house wasn't grand, but it was comfortable, with a backyard just big enough for a summer barbecue, yet small enough to mow without breaking a sweat. Thomas cherished it, not just for its warmth, but for the memories it held. His father, Henry, had poured his heart into every detail, especially the cedar fence that bordered the backyard. Each post was hand-cut, measured to perfection, and sealed with Korea labor of love that stood as a testament to Henry's craftsmanship. Thomas had made it his mission to honor his parents' legacy. He kept the lawn trimmed, the flower beds weeded, and the fence polished, even though the years had weathered its surface. The neighborhood's homeowners association, HOA, had rules, but they were reasonable, nothing like the horror stories you hear about overzealous HOAs. Thomas liked it that way. Willow Creek was a place where people waved hello, where disputes were settled over coffee, not lawsuits. Or so he thought. For years ago, the house next door, owned by the kindly Wilson family for decades, went up for sale. The Wilsons' children had moved away, and the elderly couple decided to retire to a smaller place in Vermont. The for sale sign lingered for over a year, gathering dust, until a moving truck pulled up one crisp autumn morning. Out stepped Margaret Hensley, a woman who would soon turn Thomas's peaceful life upside down. Margaret was in her late 50s, with a sharp tongue and an air of entitlement that could make a politician blush. Thomas's first impression of her wasn't kind. She reminded him of a peacock, strutting around with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. She never introduced herself, never offered a neighborly wave. Instead, she began complaining almost immediately. Her backyard, she declared to anyone who'd listen, was too small compared to Thomas's. "It's unfair," she'd mutter, loud enough for him to hear as he watered his roses. "Some people get sprawling estates, while others are trapped in a shoebox." At first, Thomas brushed it off. He dealt with difficult people before: colleagues, clients, even the occasional grumpy cashier. Margaret's passive-aggressive comments were annoying, but manageable. She complained to the HOA about his azalea bushes too wild, his garden shed an eyesore, or the faint hum of his kitchen exhaust fan, a public nuisance. Once, he came home to find her measuring his grass with a ruler, muttering about unkempt jungles. Thomas chuckled to himself, figuring she'd tire herself out eventually. After all, who had the energy to stay that petty forever? He was wrong. It was a Friday evening in June when everything changed. Thomas had been away for a week-long work conference in Chicago, a grueling trip that left him exhausted but eager to collapse on his couch with a beer. As he pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his home greeted him until his eyes caught something wrong. The cedar fence, his father's pride and joy, was gone. Not entirely, but a massive section 30 feet at least was missing, reduced to splintered debris scattered across the grass. It looked like someone had taken an axe to it, hacking away with reckless abandon. Thomas's heart pounded. He stepped out of his car, his suitcase forgotten, and stared at the gap. His first thought was that he was hallucinating, that the long flight had messed with his head. But the jagged stumps of the fence posts were real, as was the pile of broken cedar. His blood began to boil, a slow simmer that threatened to erupt. Before he could process it, a voice called out, "Oh, Thomas, I'm so sorry." It was Eleanor Grayson, the 80-year-old widow who lived across the street. She hurried toward him, her face pale with worry. Thomas had known Eleanor his whole life, baked cookies for his birthdays as a kid, and still brought him zucchini bread every summer. Now, she looked shaken, her hands trembling as she reached him. "What happened?" Thomas managed, pointing at the fence. His voice was tight, barely containing his anger. Eleanor wrung her hands. "That Margaret woman's lost her mind. I saw her this morning, out here with a chainsaw, tearing down your fence. I tried to stop her, but she screamed at me to mind my own business. Said she was taking back what's hers. I wanted to call you, but I couldn't find your number. I'm so sorry, dear." Thomas's jaw clenched. A chainsaw? In broad daylight? The audacity was staggering. He placed a reassuring hand on Eleanor's shoulder, shaking his head to signal he didn't blame her. But inside, he was seething. His father's fence, months of meticulous work, a symbol of love and legacy destroyed by a woman he barely knew. Then he saw it. Beyond the gap, in what was unmistakably his backyard, stood an inflatable pool, a gaudy lawn chair with a sunshade, and a cluster of plastic pink flamingos staked into the ground. Worse, a line of bright white spray paint snaked across his grass, with the words "New Property Line" scrawled in bold letters. It was a declaration of war, painted for all to see. Thomas's gaze shifted to Margaret's house. There she stood, at the edge of her patio, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a flowing sundress, sipping a pink drink through a curly straw. She looked like a caricature of entitlement, smug and untouchable. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and told Eleanor he'd handle it. As she shuffled back to her house, he marched toward Margaret, his fists clenched but his voice controlled. Margaret spotted him and sauntered over, her grin as sharp as a blade. "About time you showed up," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Next time, wait for an invitation before stepping onto my property." Thomas stopped short, incredulous. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded, struggling to keep his voice civil. She waved a hand dismissively. "I made some corrections. Your yard was hogging all the space, and you never even used it. I've been watching. So, I annexed the land. Now we're even. It's only fair." The word annexed hit Thomas like a slap. This wasn't a neighborly misunderstanding, this was delusion on a grand scale. "You think you can just take my property?" he said, his voice rising. "This isn't a board game. I'm calling the police and the HOA. Margaret crossed her arms, unfazed. "Adverse possession. Look it up. HOA rules say neglected property can be claimed. You were gone, your yard was a mess, and that ugly fence was dragging down the neighborhood. I fixed it. You're welcome." Thomas stared at her, dumbfounded. Adverse possession? She was throwing around legal terms like a TV lawyer, but with the confidence of someone who believed they'd already won. "You're out of your mind," he said, turning back toward his house. "This isn't over." As he walked away, Margaret called after him, her voice mocking. "Don't be so ungrateful. I could have taken more." That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the image of the shattered fence, the spray-painted grass, and Margaret's smug face. Then, a text from his neighbor on the other side, Robert Carter, changed everything. Robert's teenage son, Ethan, had filmed Margaret chainsawing the fence from a safe distance. The video was clear, undeniable evidence of her vandalism. Thomas watched it on loop, his anger hardening into resolve. This wasn't just about a fence, Anna Marie, it was about justice. The next morning, he called the police and left a voicemail for the HOA. An officer arrived within the hour, but his response was maddeningly dismissive. "This is a civil matter," the officer said, snapping photos but offering little else. "No one's hurt, nothing's stolen. Take it to court." Thomas's frustration boiled over. "She destroyed my property with a chainsaw and claimed my land. That's not civil, that's criminal." The officer shrugged. "I'm no lawyer, but being a pain in the neck isn't a crime. Civil court's your best bet." As the officer drove off, Thomas caught Margaret watching from her lawn chair, sipping her drink with that infuriating grin. She wasn't scared, she was gloating. Little did Thomas know, her brazen behavior was about to escalate, pushing him to the edge. Thomas Bennett woke to the sound of hammering, a sharp, rhythmic clatter that cut through the early morning quiet of Willow Creek. It was Saturday, barely 7 a.m., and after a sleepless night haunted by images of his father's shattered cedar fence, the noise felt like an assault. He threw on a sweatshirt and jeans, his heart already racing, and peered out his back window. There, in his backyard, stood Margaret Hensley, kneeling in the grass, driving a wooden stake into the ground with a mallet. Behind her loomed a burly man with a neck tattoo, holding a measuring tape and watching her work with a blank expression. Thomas's blood pressure spiked. This wasn't just another petty jab. Margaret was building something on his property, doubling down on her absurd claim. He stormed outside, the cool morning air doing little to temper his fury. "What do you think you're doing?" he called, striding toward her. Margaret didn't even glance up. "You're trespassing again," she said, her voice calm but laced with venom. "I told you, this is my property now. Back off." Thomas stopped a few feet away, incredulous. "Trespassing? This is my yard. You chainsawed my fence, spray-painted my grass, and now you're hammering stakes into my land. You're out of your mind." Margaret paused, resting the mallet on her knee and finally looking up. "Was your yard," she corrected, her tone dripping with condescension. "You neglected it. I took it over. Now I'm improving it. You should be thanking me." The neck-tattooed man shifted his weight, his eyes flicking between Thomas and Margaret. Thomas ignored him, focusing on her. "Where's the cedar from my fence? The pieces you didn't destroy, where are they?" For the first time, Margaret faltered, her eyes narrowing as if surprised he knew about the chainsaw. My sister needed them for her garden shed, she said after a beat. They were junk anyway. I did her a favor. Thomas's fists clenched. Those were handmade. My father spent months cutting and sealing every board. You didn't just wreck them, you gave them away like they were nothing. The man took a step forward, his posture stiff, but said nothing. Margaret rolled her eyes. Oh, please. It was scrapwood. I repurposed it. You're welcome. She went back to hammering, dismissing him as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. That was it. Thomas had tolerated her nonsense long enough. Her entitlement, her smugness, her complete disregard for his father's legacy was too much. He turned and marched back to his house, her voice trailing after him, mocking his ungrateful attitude. But Thomas wasn't defeated. He was done playing nice. Inside, he spent the day digging through old files in his father's study. He tore through cabinets, rifled through boxes, and finally found what he needed: the original receipts for the cedar fence, dated 15 years ago, and a certified property survey map outlining the exact boundaries of his lot. He also tracked down the business card of the landscaping company that had worked on his front walkway years ago. He'd know the fence's history. By evening, he had a list of property attorneys recommended by colleagues and online reviews. This wasn't just about the fence Anna Marie, it was about protecting his home, his memories, and his dignity. The next morning, Thomas called in sick to work. He wasn't proud of it, but he needed the day to act. His first call was to Paul Whitaker, a property attorney with 40 years of experience. To Thomas's surprise, Paul had met his father, Henry, years ago through a mutual friend. They hadn't been close, but Paul remembered Henry's pride in his craftsmanship. When Thomas explained Margaret's actions, chainsawing the fence, claiming his land, spray painting his grass, Paul's voice grew sharp with indignation. This woman's a piece of work, he said. I'm clearing my afternoon. Can you be at my office by 2 p.m.? Thomas agreed, grateful for the urgency. Paul's office was a 45-minute drive to a nearby town, a modest brick building with a cluttered desk and walls lined with law books. Paul, a wiry man in his late 60s with a no-nonsense demeanor, listened intently as Thomas laid out the story. He showed Paul the survey map, the receipts, and the video Robert's son had sent, which clearly showed Margaret wielding the chainsaw. Thomas also vented about the police officer's dismissal, calling it a half-hearted cop-out. Paul leaned back, tapping a pen against his desk. She's in the wrong, no question. But we need to move fast. Her adverse possession claim is nonsense. New York law requires 7 years of open, notorious use, and she's got nothing close. Still, she's bold, and bold people can cause damage if you don't shut them down. We'll file an emergency injunction to stop her from touching your property further. I'll also contact your neighbors for statement. Sounds like she's not exactly discreet. Thomas felt a flicker of hope. She's been bragging to half the neighborhood about taking what's hers. Paul grinned. Perfect. Arrogance like that makes our job easier. Over the next 2 days, Paul worked quickly. He interviewed Eleanor Grayson, who recounted Margaret's chainsaw rampage, and Robert Carter, who confirmed his son's video. Another neighbor, Susan Patel, revealed that Margaret had cornered her at the mailbox, boasting about how she'd fixed the neighborhood's property imbalance. Paul filed the injunction, citing Margaret's vandalism and trespassing, and requested immediate court action. The next afternoon, Thomas returned from work to find Margaret storming across his lawn, clutching a letter. Her face was flushed, her eyes blazing. Before he could speak, she slammed the letter against his chest. I'll see you in court, she spat, her voice trembling with rage. Thomas raised an eyebrow, keeping his cool. I'll see you in court. The injunctions were filed. The judge will be in touch. He couldn't resist a small smirk as he turned away, catching the moment her confidence cracked. Her face paled, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For a moment, Thomas thought she might back down. Surely, a court summons would scare her straight. But Margaret wasn't the type to retreat. The next morning, as Thomas grabbed his coffee and headed for his car, he froze. A new sign stood in his front yard, bold red letters screaming, "For rent, backyard suite available. Call Margaret." His jaw dropped. Not only had she destroyed his fence and claimed his land, she was now trying to rent it out for profit. Fury surged through him. He yanked the sign from the ground, stormed to Margaret's house, and pounded on her door. Before he could ring the bell, she flung it open, her eyes wild. "You're harassing me," she shrieked. "Touch my property again, and I'll report you. You're renting out my backyard." Thomas shot back, holding up the sign. "This is my land, Margaret. You can't just claim it because you feel like it." She crossed her arms, smirking. "It's mine now. I can lease it to whoever I want, for whatever price I want, until a judge says otherwise. That's the law." Thomas laughed, a bitter sound. "You think stealing my property and defacing it is legal? You're delusional." He tossed the sign onto her porch, where it clattered against the steps. "You cut down my father's fence, vandalized my yard, and now this. It's not how the world works." Margaret clapped her hands together, her face contorted with mock exasperation. "That fence was a rotting eyesore. I removed it, improved the property, and gave myself the space I deserve. You get a better view. I get a bigger yard. Everyone wins. Why are you still whining?" Thomas opened his mouth to retort, but stopped. Arguing with her was like wrestling a pig and mud only drag him down with her. He turned and walked away, ignoring her shouts to repeat that to her phone as she fumbled to record him. Back at home, he called Paul, his hands shaking as he recounted the sign. Paul's response was calm but firm. "She's digging her own grave. Keep that sign as evidence. I'll add it to the file." Later that day, Paul called with surprising news. "She's countersuing you," he said. "Claims you built the fence on her property with rotting wood. Says the survey is outdated and submitted a Google Maps printout with a hand-drawn line as proof." Thomas was stunned. "My father built that fence 15 years ago with a certified survey. She's using a Google Maps doodle?" Paul chuckled. "Exactly. It's laughable, but she's banking on bluster. Don't worry, the judge will see through it. I'm just warning you so you're not blindsided in court." Thomas hung up, his mind racing. Margaret's audacity was infuriating, but also unsettling. What if she managed to spin her lies convincingly? The thought gnawed at him, setting the stage for a courtroom showdown that would test his patience and resolve. Thomas Bennett spent the days leading up to the court hearing in a state of restless anticipation. The quiet streets of Willow Creek, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a battlefield. Every time he stepped into his backyard, the sight of the spray-painted new property line and the scattered debris of his father's cedar fence reignited his anger. Margaret Hensley's audacity cainsawing his fence, claiming his land, and now trying to rent it out had pushed him to his limit. But with Paul Whitaker, his seasoned property attorney, in his corner, Thomas felt a growing confidence that justice was within reach. Paul had been busy. He'd gathered statements from neighbors, including Eleanor Grayson's vivid account of Margaret's chainsaw rampage and Susan Patel's report of Margaret's boastful rants. The video from Robert Carter's son, Ethan, was a cornerstone of their case, showing Margaret in the act of destruction. Paul had also secured a formal letter from the Willow Creek HOA, debunking Margaret's claim that Thomas's yard was neglected or that the fence violated any rules. The certified property survey from 15 years ago, along with receipts for the cedar boards, solidified Thomas's ownership. Paul's strategy was clear: overwhelm Margaret's flimsy arguments with hard evidence. Still, Thomas couldn't shake a nagging worry. Margaret's confidence, however delusional, was unnerving. What if she managed to charm the judge or spin her lies into something believable? Her countersuit claiming the fence was built on her property with rotting wood was absurd, but her boldness suggested she believed she could win. Thomas tried to focus on Paul's assurances, but the stakes felt higher than ever. This wasn't just about land, it was about his father's legacy, his home, and his right to live in peace. The morning of the hearing, Thomas dressed in a crisp navy suit, one he hadn't worn since his father's funeral. The courthouse, a stately brick building in the county seat, was a 30-minute drive from Willow Creek. As he parked, his stomach churned with nerves. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than he'd expected, with polished wooden benches and a faint smell of old books. Paul was already there, reviewing notes, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Thomas's racing pulse. Margaret arrived minutes later, strutting in like she owned the place. She wore a tailored pantsuit, oversized sunglasses perched on her head, and clutched a thick folder to her chest. Her expression was one of smug certainty, as if she were about to deliver a winning performance. Thomas tried not to let her theatrics rattle him, but her confidence was a reminder of how far she was willing to go. The question was whether her bravado would hold up under scrutiny. The judge, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, took her seat at the bench. Judge Clara Mitchell had a reputation for being fair but no nonsense, a fact Paul had mentioned with approval. As the hearing began, she called Margaret to present her case first, her tone neutral but expectant. Margaret stood, smoothing her jacket, and launched into her argument with the fervor of a televangelist. "Your Honor, I'm a homeowner fighting for what's rightfully mine," she began. "The land in question was invalidly split years ago, and I have evidence proving I'm entitled to an additional 40 feet that overlaps with Mr. Bennett's property." She held up her evidence, a printed Google Maps image with a hand-drawn line in red ink, marking what she claimed was the corrected property line. Thomas exchanged a glance with Paul, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustle of papers as Judge Mitchell examined the printout. "This appears to be a screenshot from a navigation website," she observed, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Correct, Your Honor," Margaret said, undeterred. "With the property lines corrected. I drew them myself, using a ruler for precision. I'm very detail-oriented." She shot Thomas a side eye, her smirk suggesting she thought she'd clinched the case. The judge's expression remained unreadable. "These lines are drawn with a pen," she noted, holding up the paper. "You're claiming this is legal evidence?" "Yes, Your Honor," Margaret replied, her voice brimming with confidence. "It's accurate and clear. The original survey is outdated, and Mr. Bennett's fence was an eyesore built on my land. I removed it to improve the neighborhood." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, mostly from the handful of Willow Creek neighbors who'd come to watch. Thomas's hands tightened around the armrest of his chair. Margaret's gall was staggering. She was doubling down on her lies, betting everything on her audacity. Judge Mitchell turned to Paul. "Mr. Whitaker, your response?" Paul stood, his posture relaxed, but his voice firm. "Your Honor, my client, Thomas Bennett, has owned his property for years, inherited from his late father, who built the cedar fence in question along a certified property line. We've submitted a survey from 15 years ago, legally binding and unchallenged until now. We also have photographs of the fence, landscaping appraisals confirming its placement, and a video showing Ms. Hensley destroying it with a chainsaw." He paused, letting the weight of the video sink in. "Additionally, we have signed statements from neighbors who witnessed Ms. Hensley's actions and heard her boast about annexing my client's land. She's made no effort to hide her intentions. In fact, she's bragged about them. We've also included a letter from the Willow Creek HOA, refuting her claims of neglect or rule violations. Finally, Ms. Hensley's so-called assistant, who helped her trespass, is an unlicensed individual with a recent criminal record." Margaret's smirk vanished. "He's not unlicensed," she snapped, her voice cutting through the courtroom. "He's just unavailable for testimony." A few spectators chuckled, and Margaret whipped her head around, glaring at the source of the sound. Judge Mitchell raised a hand, silencing the room. "Ms. Hensley, you'll have your chance to respond." "Mr. Whitaker, continue." Paul nodded. "Ms. Hensley's countersuit relies on a hand-drawn map with no legal standing. Her claim of adverse possession is baseless. New York law requires 7 years of continuous, open use, which she cannot prove. She's vandalized my client's property, trespassed, and attempted to lease his land for profit. We request an immediate injunction to stop further harm and compensation for the damages." Thomas watched as Margaret's composure crumbled. Her folder, once held like a shield, now sagged in her hands. Judge Mitchell leaned back, her eyes scanning the evidence before her. "I've heard enough," she said, picking up her gavel. "This case is straightforward. I'm granting the plaintiff's injunction immediately. The defendant will remove all structures, personal items, and signage from Mr. Bennett's property within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in court-ordered penalties." Thomas exhaled, relief flooding through him. But the judge wasn't done. "Ms. Hensley will also pay for the destruction of the original cedar fence, cover the cost of rebuilding a new one with comparable materials, and compensate for landscape repairs and court fees." She banged the gavel, the sound echoing like a victory bell. Margaret shot to her feet. "This is a miscarriage of justice," she shouted, her voice shrill. "I'm a homeowner. I have rights." Judge Mitchell's gaze was icy. "Homeowners have the right to follow the law, Ms. Hensley. Sit down." The courtroom buzzed as Margaret sank into her seat, her face red with fury. Thomas glanced at Paul, who gave him a subtle nod. It was over, or so he thought. As he left the courthouse, a weight lifted from his shoulders, but a small part of him wondered if Margaret would comply. Her outburst suggested she wasn't ready to back down. The next day, Thomas went to work with a lighter heart, though the loss of his father's fence still stung. When he returned home, the inflatable pool, lawn chair, and pink flamingos were gone from his backyard. Robert Carter stopped by, grinning. "You should have seen it," he said. Court officers showed up this morning to serve the ruling. Margaret screamed until her voice gave out, then locked herself inside until they forced her to clear everything. Thomas laughed, imagining the scene. She didn't try to fight them? Oh, she tried, Robert said. But they weren't having it. She's lucky they didn't haul her off for contempt. Over the next few days, Thomas noticed more changes. The spray paint on his grass had been scrubbed away, though faint traces remained. Paul called with good news. A professional landscaping company, recommended by the HOA, would rebuild the fence. A new survey confirmed Thomas's property line, revealing that the original fence had been 3 feet inside his lot. The new fence would sit exactly on the boundary, shrinking Margaret's yard by a small but satisfying margin. The landscaping company began work the following week, using rich cedar that matched his father's original choice. Thomas made a bold decision. He upgraded the materials and had the fence built taller 6 feet instead of 5. It was a splurge, but worth it, especially since Margaret would foot the bill. Word around the neighborhood was that she'd taken out a second mortgage to cover the costs, a rumor that brought Thomas a quiet sense of poetic justice. But Margaret's downfall didn't end there. A for sale sign appeared in her front yard a month later. Thomas heard through Susan Patel that Margaret had tried to sell the house at market price, but her toxic reputation, spread by neighbors fed up with her antics, scared off buyers. She slashed the price repeatedly until a quiet older couple, the Harrisons, bought it at a bargain. They moved in shortly after, bringing with them homemade cookies and a warmth that reminded Thomas of the Willow Creek he'd grown up in. As the new fence took shape, its cedar scent filling the air, Thomas felt his father's presence. The battle had been exhausting, but he'd won not just for himself, but for the legacy Henry had left behind. Yet, as he stood in his backyard, watching the final posts go up, he couldn't help but wonder what drove someone like Margaret to such extremes, and how many others were out there, ready to trample boundaries for their gain. The scent of fresh cedar filled Thomas Bennett's backyard as the new fence took shape under the late summer sun. Willow Creek had regained its quiet charm, the kind of peace that made you want to sit on the porch with a glass of iced tea and watch the world go by. But for Thomas, the victory over Margaret Hensley was bittersweet. The new fence, taller and sturdier than his father's original, was a triumph, yet it couldn't erase the sting of what had been lost. Every time he looked at the pristine cedar posts, he saw the splintered remains of Henry Bennett's handiwork, hacked apart by a woman who thought she could rewrite boundaries with a chainsaw. The landscaping company worked efficiently, their tools humming as they set the final posts along the corrected property line. The new survey had been a small but satisfying revelation. Thomas's original fence had sat 3 feet inside his property, meaning Margaret's yard was now slightly smaller. It was a petty win, but Thomas couldn't help but smile at the irony. Margaret had fought to annex his land, only to lose ground in the end. Better still, the upgraded material stop-grade cedar and weather-resistant sealant had driven the cost high enough to force Margaret into a second mortgage. Neighborhood gossip, courtesy of Susan Patel, confirmed that Margaret's financial strain was real, and Thomas felt a quiet satisfaction knowing her actions had consequences. As the fence neared completion, Thomas found himself spending evenings in his backyard, watching the workers and reflecting on the ordeal. The battle with Margaret had been more than a property dispute. It was a test of his resolve, his patience, and his commitment to his father's legacy. Henry had been a man of principle, the kind who believed in doing things right, even when it was hard. The cedar fence wasn't just wood and nails, it was a symbol of his father's belief that hard work and integrity mattered. Margaret's destruction of it felt like an attack on that belief, and Thomas's fight to restore it was his way of honoring Henry's memory. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eleanor Grayson shuffled across the street with a plate of her famous zucchini bread. Her steps were slower these days, but her eyes sparkled with the same warmth Thomas remembered from childhood. "It's looking beautiful," she said, nodding at the fence. "Your dad would be proud." Thomas took the plate, his throat tightening. "I hope so, Eleanor. It's not the same, but it's close." She patted his arm. "It's not about the wood, dear. It's about what it stands for. You stood up to that woman, and you did it the right way. That's what Henry would have cared about." Her words lingered long after she left. Thomas sat on his patio, slicing into the warm bread, and thought about what the right way meant. He'd been tempted, more than once, to lose his Temperdo scream at Margaret, to tear down her inflatable pool, to match her chaos with his own. But he hadn't. He'd gathered evidence, hired a lawyer, and trusted the system, even when the police brushed him off. It hadn't been easy, especially when Margaret escalated her antics with that "for rent" sign, but restraint had paid off. Still, he wondered, had he been too passive at first? Could he have stopped her sooner? The neighborhood was abuzz with Margaret's downfall. Robert Carter stopped by one afternoon, his teenage son Ethan in tow, to check on the fence's progress. "Heard she's selling the house," Robert said, leaning against Thomas's mailbox. "Dropped the price 3 times already. Nobody wants to live next to a story like hers." Ethan, fiddling with his phone, looked up. "She was nuts. I mean, who chainsaws a fence and thinks they'll get away with it?" Thomas chuckled. "Someone who thinks the rules don't apply to them." Robert nodded. "You handled it better than I would have. I'd have been out there with a baseball bat the second I saw that spray paint." The comment, half joking, sparked a question Thomas had been wrestling with. Where was the line between standing up for yourself and stooping to someone else's level? Margaret's actions were indefensible, but her unhinged behavior made him wonder what drove her. Was it greed, envy, or something deeper, like a need to control everything around her? He didn't have answers, but the question gnawed at him, a reminder that conflicts like this weren't always black and white. The "for sale" sign in Margaret's yard became a neighborhood landmark, a symbol of her defeat. Susan Patel, ever the gossip, reported that Margaret had tried to spin her story to realtors, claiming the court case was a misunderstanding. But Willow Creek was a small community, and word traveled fast. Potential buyers heard about the chainsaw, the spray paint, and the courtroom debacle, and most walked away. Margaret's reputation as the neighborhood tyrant was cemented, and Thomas couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing she'd brought it on herself. One morning, as Thomas sipped coffee on his porch, a moving truck pulled up to Margaret's house. A quiet older couple, the Harrisons, stepped out, followed by a realtor. Thomas watched from a distance, curious but cautious. The Harrisons, both in their late 60s, seemed the opposite of Margaret, reserved, polite, and unassuming. Later that day, they knocked on his door, introducing themselves with a basket of homemade oatmeal cookies. "We heard about the, situation," Mr. Harrison said, his voice gentle. "We just want to be good neighbors. No drama." Mrs. Harrison smiled, her eyes crinkling. "We love the smell of cedar, by the way. That new fence is gorgeous." Thomas invited them in, grateful for their warmth. Over coffee, they shared stories of their old home in Connecticut and their hope for a peaceful retirement. It was a stark contrast to Margaret's hostility, and Thomas felt a weight lift. The Harrisons' arrival was a sign that Willow Creek could return to its roots, a place where neighbors looked out for each other, not tore each other down. But even as life settled, Thomas couldn't fully let go of the ordeal. The new fence was a victory, but it came at a cost not just financial, but emotional. He'd spent months consumed by anger and stress, replaying Margaret's smug grin and the police officer's shrug. The courtroom win had been cathartic, but it hadn't erased the violation of his space, his memories. He wondered how others dealt with similar injustices. Did they fight like he had, or did they give in to avoid the hassle? The question felt universal, a thread connecting his story to countless others. One evening, Thomas sat down with Paul Whitaker's final bill, which detailed the court fees and landscaping costs Margaret had been ordered to pay. The total was staggering, a number that explained her second mortgage. Paul had also sent a note, congratulating Thomas on his patience and resolve. "Most people would have lost it," Paul wrote. "You played it smart, and it paid off." Thomas appreciated the sentiment, but he wasn't sure he felt smart. He'd done what he had to, but the process had been draining. He thought about his father, who'd faced his challenges: a tough boss, a tight budget, a cancer diagnosis, without ever losing his cool. Henry's strength wasn't in fighting battles, but in building things that lasted, like the fence, the house, and the values he'd passed to Thomas. That legacy, Thomas realized, was what had carried him through. As the fence's final touches were added a glossy sealant and sturdy gate, Thomas invited Eleanor, Robert, and Susan over for a small backyard gathering. It wasn't a celebration, exactly, but a moment to mark the end of a chapter. They sat under string lights, sipping lemonade and swapping stories about Willow Creek's past. Eleanor reminisced about Henry's barbecues. Robert joked about Ethan's newfound fame as the chainsaw videographer, and Susan shared the latest rumor. Margaret had moved to a condo in a neighboring town, still complaining about unfair neighbors. The gathering felt like a reclaiming of Thomas's space, a way to overwrite the chaos Margaret had brought. But as the night wound down, Thomas's thoughts turned to the bigger picture. Margaret's actions had been extreme, but they weren't unique. People crossed boundaries every day, sometimes with chainsaws, sometimes with words or power plays. How did you fight back without losing yourself? And what did justice mean when the damage couldn't be undone? These questions lingered as Thomas cleaned up after his guests, the new fence glowing under the moonlight. He wasn't sure he had answers, but he knew one thing. He'd fought for what mattered, and he'd won. The Harrisons' cookies, Eleanor's bread, and the cedar's scent were proof that Willow Creek was still home. But the battle had changed him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to learn from it, lessons about resilience, community, and the cost of standing your ground. Autumn arrived in Willow Creek with a crispness that turned the maple trees into bursts of red and gold. Thomas Bennett's backyard, once a battleground, was now a sanctuary again. The new cedar fence stood tall, its 6-foot posts gleaming under a fresh coat of sealant, a quiet rebuke to the chaos Margaret Hensley had unleashed. The scent of cedar mingled with the earthy aroma of fallen leaves, and for the first time in months, Thomas felt at peace. The fight was over, the fence was rebuilt, and his father's legacy was intact. But as he stood on his patio, sipping coffee and watching the morning mist lift, he knew the victory had come with lessons he'd carry for the rest of his life. The landscaping company had finished the fence weeks ago, and the final to Chase's sturdy gate and decorative post caps gave it a polished look that even Henry Bennett would have admired. Thomas had walked the property line with the crew, marveling at how the new survey had shaved 3 feet off Margaret's yard. It was a small detail, but it felt like justice, a tangible reminder that her greed had backfired. The cost of the fence, court fees, and landscaping repairs had hit Margaret hard. Susan Patel, the neighborhood's unofficial news hub, reported that Margaret's second mortgage was just the start. Sold her house at a loss to the Harrisons, the quiet couple who'd brought warmth back to the street. The Harrisons settled in quickly, their presence a balm after Margaret's reign of terror. They invited Thomas over for dinner one evening, serving pot roast and apple pie in a dining room filled with family photos and soft jazz. Mr. Harrison, a retired teacher, shared stories of his students, while Mrs. Harrison, a former librarian, recommended books on gardening. Their kindness was genuine, and Thomas found himself laughing more than he had in months. "We're just happy to be here," Mrs. Harrison said, passing him a slice of pie. "And that fancy, it's a work of art." Thomas smiled, his chest tightening with gratitude. "It means a lot. My dad built the original, and losing it hurt." Mr. Harrison nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "You fought for it, though? That's what counts. Not everyone would have." The conversation stayed with Thomas as he walked home, the stars bright above Willow Creek. The Harrisons were fought, and he'd won. But the fight had been more than a legal battle. It had forced him to confront his limits, to balance anger with restraint, and to lean on his community in ways he hadn't expected. Eleanor Grayson's support, Robert Carter's video, Susan Patel's gossip, and Paul Whitaker's expertise had all played a role. Willow Creek wasn't just a place. It was a network of people who'd rallied around him when it mattered most. Reflecting on the ordeal, Thomas often thought about Margaret. Her actions, chainsawing his fence, spray painting his grass, trying to rent his land, were so brazen they bordered on caricature. Yet, beneath her arrogance, he sensed something broken. Was it envy of his larger yard? A need to dominate? Or a deeper insecurity that drove her to trample boundaries? He'd never know, and part of him didn't want to. Understanding her wouldn't undo the damage. Still, her behavior raised questions that haunted him. How do you deal with someone who refuses to play by the rules? And how do you protect what's yours without losing your sense of right and wrong? One Saturday, Thomas invited Eleanor, Robert, Susan, and the Harrisons for a barbecue to christen the new fence. It was the kind of gathering his father had loved, simple, warm, with burgers sizzling on the grill and laughter filling the air. The backyard, once defaced by Margaret's spray paint, was now lush and green, the faint scars of her vandalism fading with time. Ethan, Robert's son, showed up with his phone, joking about his viral chainsaw video. "I should have posted it online," he said, grinning. "Could have made some cash." Susan laughed, sipping her lemonade. "Oh, Margaret would have sued you for that, too. She was ready to fight the world. Eleanor, nibbling on a corn cob, shook her head. I've lived here 50 years, and I've never seen anything like her. Cutting down a fence in broad daylight. It's like something out of a movie. Mr. Harrison, ever the diplomat, chimed in. People like that they thrive on control, but they always overplay their hand. You prove that, Thomas. The praise felt good, but Thomas deflected it. I had help. Paul, the neighbors, the judge, everyone played a part. I just kept my head down and did what I had to. As the evening wound down, Thomas stood by the fence, running his hand along its smooth surface. The cedar was flawless, but it wasn't his father's. That loss would always sting, a reminder that some things couldn't be fully restored. Yet, the new fence was more than a replacement. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing up to injustice and coming out stronger. Henry had taught him that legacy wasn't just in things, but in actions, and Thomas had honored that by fighting the right way. The next morning, Thomas found a letter in his mailbox from Paul Whitaker. It was a final summary of the case, confirming that Margaret had paid all court-ordered fees, though grudgingly. Paul included a personal note. You handled this with more grace than most. Your father would be proud. If you ever need me, you know where to find me. Thomas tucked the letter into a drawer, alongside the old fence receipts and survey map. They were keepsakes now, part of the story he'd tell someday, maybe to his kids, if he ever had them, or to the Harrisons over coffee. Life in Willow Creek returned to its gentle rhythm. The Harrisons became regular visitors, sharing fruit from their peach tree and inviting Thomas to their book club. Eleanor's zucchini bread remained a staple, and Robert occasionally dropped by with Ethan to shoot hoops in Thomas's driveway. Susan kept the neighborhood gossip flowing. Though without Margaret, her stories were tamer, mostly about whose dog was digging up whose garden. The for sale sign was gone, Margaret was a memory, and the cedar fence stood as a quiet sentinel, guarding Thomas's peace. But the experience had changed Thomas. He was more aware of his boundaries, both physical and personal, and more appreciative of the community that had supported him. He also found himself thinking about justice, not just the legal kind, but the moral kind. Margaret's punishment, financial ruin, a forced move, a tarnished reputation was fitting, but it didn't erase the violation of his space. True justice, he realized, was in reclaiming his home and moving forward, not dwelling on her downfall. One quiet evening, as Thomas sat on his porch with a book, he jotted down a few thoughts in a journal he'd started during the ordeal. Life tests you, he wrote. Sometimes it's a person like Margaret, sometimes it's something else. But it's not about the fight, it's about what you hold on to and what you let go. I held on to my dad's values and let go of the anger. That's what made the difference. Closing the journal, Thomas looked out at his backyard, the fence glowing under the porch light. It was more than wood, it was a promise kept, a legacy preserved. He'd faced a bully, navigated a system that wasn't always fair, and come out stronger. Willow Creek was home again, and that was enough. As the seasons changed, Thomas felt ready to share his story, not just with neighbors, but with anyone who'd listen. It was a tale of property and pride, but also of community, resilience, and the quiet power of doing what's right. He hoped it would spark conversations, maybe even inspire someone else to stand their ground. Because in the end, life wasn't about avoiding battles, it was about fighting the ones that mattered and winning them with integrity. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Thomas's battle with the chainsaw neighbor. This story isn't just about a fence, it's about standing up to injustice, protecting what matters, and finding strength in community. But it also raises tough questions. How do you handle someone who crosses your boundaries? Is violence, whether with a chainsaw or words, ever justified? And what does justice mean when the damage is done? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you faced a Margaret in your life? How did you respond? Do you think Thomas did the right thing by staying calm and going through the courts? Or should he have confronted her more directly? Share your stories, your perspectives, and let's start a conversation about violence, injustice, and the power of standing your ground. Your voice matters. Let's keep this discussion going.